took the night security job at Lakeside Carnival on a whim. It was an off-season position, meant to last only through the winter while the park went through renovations and an equipment upgrade. Nothing fancy, but the pay wasn't bad for what seemed like a simple gig. Besides, I've always preferred night work, the quiet hours, and the solitude. I'm not a people person, and the idea of roaming an empty theme park under the stars was oddly appealing. The park had been around for decades. Tucked away on the edge of town near a small lake, it was the kind of place that was bursting with life in the summer and felt like a ghost town in the winter. Rides that would have been filled with screams and laughter stood silent, their bright colors dulled in the moonlight. The whole place had an eerie beauty to it at night. The way the roller coaster's tracks twisted up into the sky like skeletal hands reaching out for something. It felt still, like it was holding its breath. On my first night, I met Mr. Davidson, the park's manager. He was an older man, probably in his mid-60s, with graying hair and a face that looked worn from years of long shifts and the pressures of running the place. As he walked me around the empty park, showing me my route and the key locations, he spoke in a low, gruff voice that barely broke the silence. "Listen," he said, stopping near the carousel. "There are some things you need to keep in mind during your shifts here. This place isn't like the others. It's got a history. Some of it good, some of it not so much. Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." I chuckled, brushing it off. "Rules? Like don't ride the Ferris wheel alone or make sure the clowns don't escape?" He didn't laugh. Instead, he handed me a small, worn piece of paper, folded and creased like it had been opened and closed 100 times. Across the top, in faded ink, were the words, "Night Security Rules." Below, in the same old-fashioned script, a list of instructions. Never look directly at the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. If you hear carnival music, follow it to the entrance and wait until it stops. Do not enter the funhouse alone. If someone dressed as a clown waves at you, turn around and walk away. The list seemed absurd, and I chuckled again, expecting him to say it was a joke. But when I looked up, Davidson's face was grim. He met my gaze, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Worry? Fear? "Do not," he said, his voice low, "under any circumstances, break these rules." I shrugged, feeling a strange discomfort settle in my stomach. But I nodded. "Sure thing. If it keeps the ghosts at bay, I'll do it." Davidson left me with a firm handshake and one final reminder to check the list whenever I felt uneasy. I watched him leave, his figure disappearing into the darkness beyond the park gates, and then I turned to look at the paper in my hand. The first rule felt innocuous enough. Never look directly at the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. I glanced over at the carousel, a colorful fixture even in the dim light. The horses were lined up in silent parade, frozen in mid-gallop, their manes captured in a permanent wave. Their glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I walked by, an effect that was eerie at night. But Davidson's warning lingered, and I tucked the list into my pocket, telling myself it was just some quirky attempt to add mystery to the place. The park was still and quiet, an unnatural silence that settled deep into the empty spaces between the rides and food stalls. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, towering above the park like a watchful eye. I felt a faint chill, and I told myself it was just the cool night air seeping through my jacket. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I began my rounds. The hours passed slowly. I wandered through the empty paths, the only sounds the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional creak of an old ride swaying in the wind. Around midnight, I found myself back near the carousel, and I paused, glancing at the clock on my phone. 12:15. The rules said not to look at it after 1 a.m., and I had no problem obeying that. I decided to keep moving, staying close to the edge of the park, where the woods crept up close to the fences. My mind started to wander, drawn to the oddities of the place, the aging rides, the faded posters, the way the park felt almost frozen in time. It was as if it had been waiting, holding on to its past, like a memory that refused to fade. At one point, I passed by the funhouse. In the day, it was bright and cheerful, with a cartoonish face painted above the entrance. But now, in the dim light, it looked different, almost sinister. The colors were faded, and the once smiling face seemed to have twisted into a leer. I felt an irrational urge to go inside, to walk through the twisting halls and see what lay at the end. But Rule 3 lingered in my mind. Do not enter the funhouse alone. I laughed to myself, dismissing the impulse. I was alone in a deserted theme park at night, after all. Who wouldn't feel a little jumpy? As I continued my patrol, I caught sight of the clown statues scattered throughout the park. They were relics from the park's early days, dressed in garish, old-fashioned costumes and frozen in a perpetual wave or a cheerful grin. Something about them was unsettling. The way their painted smiles seemed a little too wide, a little too fixed. And that last rule, if someone dressed as a clown waves at you, turn around and walk away. It was ridiculous. Who would be dressed as a clown here, at this hour? I shook my head, dismissing the strange list once again. It was nothing more than a set of superstitions, an old security guard's joke left behind to spook the newbies. I told myself that over and over as I made my way back to the entrance. As I stood there, taking in the quiet, a faint sound drifted through the air, the distant, tinkling notes of carnival music. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It was faint, almost like a memory, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the park. I reached for the list in my pocket, unfolding it with trembling fingers. Rule 2. If you hear carnival music, follow it to the entrance and wait until it stops. The music was growing louder, filling the air with a tune that was both cheerful and haunting. I forced myself to move, to follow the path back to the entrance, my footsteps quick and uneven. The music continued, echoing through the empty park, a haunting melody that seemed to wrap around me, drawing me in. When I reached the entrance, I stopped, glancing around as the music continued to play, faint but persistent. I waited, my pulse quickening, until finally the music faded, trailing off into silence. I let out a shaky breath, glancing down at the list in my hand. The rules had seemed like nonsense at first, a silly joke meant to unsettle me. But now, standing alone in the dark, I wasn't so sure. Something about the park felt different, as if it had come alive, aware of my presence. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the park was watching me. By dawn, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been in my head, just nerves playing tricks on me. But that morning, lying in bed, the faint strains of carnival music still echoed in my mind. It was the kind of tune you couldn't forget even if you wanted to. The notes lingered, twisting around in my head as I drifted off to sleep. The following night, I returned to the park, a slight feeling of unease gnawing at me. I told myself it was nothing, that the music had probably come from a forgotten speaker or an automated system that turned on by accident. That's all it could have been. I repeated this in my mind as I went through my rounds, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The night was colder, a biting chill in the air that seemed to seep into my bones. I kept the list of rules in my pocket, my fingers brushing against the worn paper every so often, as though it could somehow protect me. I'd thought about ignoring the rules, maybe even testing them. But the memory of that music, the way it had wound its way through the empty park, held me back. As I passed the carousel, I glanced at the clock on my phone. 12:55. 5 minutes to go before the first rule would apply. A trickle of dread ran down my spine as I realized I didn't want to be anywhere near the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. I turned away, deciding to circle around the park, to give the carousel a wide berth. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At exactly 1 o'clock, I heard a faint sound, just a soft whir, like gears beginning to turn. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced back, half expecting to see the carousel starting up on its own. But the horses stood still, frozen in mid-gallop, their glassy eyes staring blankly out into the night. I tried to look away, to continue on my path, but my gaze was drawn to them, an irresistible urge to look directly at the carousel, to confront whatever was happening. I took a step closer, the rules slipping from my mind as the whirring sound grew louder. The air felt heavier, pressing down on me, filling my ears with a low hum that made it hard to think. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt slightly as I stepped closer to the carousel, drawn to it despite myself. Just as I reached the edge of the platform, my phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the spell. I jolted, pulling myself back, and quickly turned away, my heart racing. I walked briskly toward the other side of the park, forcing myself to ignore the carousel. Even as the whirring sound faded into silence, I didn't dare look back. My phone buzzed again, a message lighting up the screen. It was from Davidson, the park manager. "Follow the rules." That was all it said, just those 3 words. I felt a chill run through me. I hadn't told Davidson about my shift, or that I'd even considered testing the rules. How could he have known? I shoved my phone back into my pocket, my hand trembling slightly, and continued my rounds, keeping my gaze firmly fixed ahead. The air felt wrong as I moved through the park, the silence more oppressive than ever. It was as though the rides themselves were watching, waiting for something to happen. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night sky, its empty seats swaying gently in the wind. I could almost hear it creak, a soft groan that sounded unnervingly like a sigh. Just after 2 a.m., I passed by the funhouse. The entrance was still, the cartoonish face painted above the doorway twisted into a smile that now looked sinister in the dark. The door creaked slightly in the breeze, swinging open just a crack, as if inviting me inside. I felt a strange urge to enter, to walk through the dimly lit halls and see what lay at the end. But the rule echoed in my mind: do not enter the funhouse alone. I shuddered, turning away, forcing myself to walk back toward the main path. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each step feeling heavier, as though the ground itself was dragging me down. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the entrance, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the gaping entrance of the funhouse, its twisted grin mocking me. The silence pressed in around me as I continued my rounds, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I thought about Davidson's message, the way he'd known exactly what I'd been doing, as though he were watching from somewhere beyond the park's gates. I glanced at my phone again, almost expecting another message, but the screen was dark. As the clock neared 3 a.m., I returned to the entrance, eager to finish my shift. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Just as I was about to settle back into my chair, a faint sound drifted through the air, the distant strains of carnival music. My blood ran cold, and I reached for the list in my pocket, unfolding it with trembling fingers. Rule 2. If you hear carnival music, follow it to the entrance and wait until it stops. I forced myself to stay calm, to follow the instructions, even as the music grew louder, filling the air with a haunting tune. The melody was slow, almost mournful, each note hanging in the air before fading into silence. I stood there, listening, my pulse racing as the music echoed through the empty park, a sound that didn't belong. I glanced around, expecting to see lights flickering on, the rides springing to life in some nightmarish display. But the park remained dark, the rides still, and the only movement was the gentle sway of the Ferris wheel in the distance. The music continued, winding its way through the air, a melody that felt strangely familiar, as though I'd heard it before, long ago. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down, half expecting another message from Davidson. But the screen was blank, and when I looked up, the music had stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy stillness that pressed down on me, filling my ears with a ringing that wouldn't fade. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart pounding as the reality of the rules settled over me. They weren't just guidelines, they were warnings, boundaries meant to keep me safe from whatever lurked in the shadows of Lakeside Carnival. I glanced around, my gaze sweeping over the darkened rides, the empty stalls, the rows of clown statues frozen in perpetual cheer. For the first time, I felt as though the park itself were alive, aware of my presence, watching me from every corner, every shadow. Just then, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my heart racing, but saw nothing. The shadows seemed to shift, pooling in strange shapes that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on them. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But the sense of unease grew stronger, a knot of dread settling in my stomach. The sound of gravel crunching broke the silence, and I froze. Someone, or something, was moving toward me, footsteps echoing in the stillness. I gripped my flashlight, the beam wavering slightly as I pointed it toward the source of the sound. But the footsteps stopped, and the darkness swallowed whatever had been there. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced back at the entrance, suddenly desperate to leave, to escape the strange pull of the park. But my shift wasn't over, and I knew I couldn't leave until dawn. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and continued my rounds, forcing myself to ignore the shadows that seemed to close in around me. The rules felt heavier now, their words echoing in my mind, a reminder that there were forces at work in the park that I couldn't understand. I could feel their presence, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to make a mistake. And as I walked, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. The weight of the silence bore down on me as I made my way through the park. The rides loomed like towering skeletons, their frames twisted and shadowed, each one standing as a silent witness to the strange occurrences of the night. Despite my efforts to stay calm, an unsettling realization settled over me. This place was watching, waiting, and somehow it was aware of my every move. As I continued my patrol, a strange compulsion grew within me, a pull I couldn't resist. It was almost as if the park itself were guiding me, leading me down winding paths, past the silent games booths and empty snack stands. The familiar layout felt distorted, the paths stretching longer, twisting in ways I couldn't quite remember. I wanted to turn back, to escape the maze of shadows, but something drove me forward, an unspoken demand whispering at the edges of my mind. The pull grew stronger as I approached the carousel, and before I knew it, I was standing just a few feet away, drawn by a force I couldn't understand. The horses stood in perfect stillness, their glassy eyes fixed on me, their once playful expressions frozen in something that now felt like malice. I swallowed hard, remembering the first rule: never look directly at the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. But it was already too late. A flicker of light caught my eye, and I turned to see the carousel coming to life. The faint whir of gears filled the air, followed by the slow creak of metal as the platform began to rotate, each horse bobbing up and down in a slow, ghostly parade. The music started softly, just a whisper of a tune, but it grew louder, filling the air with a melody that was both haunting and strangely familiar. I tried to look away, but my gaze was locked on the carousel, trapped in the rhythmic rise and fall of the horses. My pulse quickened, and I felt a strange, creeping fear settle over me, an understanding that I was witnessing something forbidden, something I shouldn't have seen. I wanted to turn and run, to escape the pull of the music and the carousel, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. Suddenly, I saw something move between the horses. A figure, shadowed and indistinct, darting in and out of sight as the platform spun. I blinked, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, but the figure remained, moving with the same slow, steady rhythm as the horses. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was watching me, its gaze piercing through the darkness. The figure stepped closer, slipping between the horses with an ease that defied logic. I caught glimpses of a face, a pale, painted smile, eyes dark and hollow, a hint of red around the lips. The makeup was smudged, the features distorted, twisted into a grin that was too wide, too empty. My heart raced as I remembered the last rule. If someone dressed as a clown waves at you, turn around and walk away. But I couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, one hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave, its smile widening, stretching impossibly across its face. I took a step back, my pulse pounding, but the clown kept coming, weaving between the horses as it closed the distance. The carousel picked up speed, the horses bobbing faster, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. The music grew louder, the notes blurring into a discordant melody that filled my head, drowning out my thoughts. "Stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible, swallowed by the relentless tune. "Please, just stop." The clown paused, its gaze locked on mine, and for a brief moment I thought it would listen, that it would stop. But then it moved again, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It was close now, just a few feet away, its hand still raised in that mocking wave, its painted smile stretched into a leer. I stumbled backward, the weight of the fear pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The clown's eyes were dark, empty, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, piercing through me. I tried to look away, to break the spell, but my gaze was locked on its face, trapped in the horrible, distorted grin. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The clown tilted its head, as if considering my question, its smile widening. It raised a hand pointing at me, its finger held steady, accusing. And then it spoke, its voice soft, a whisper that seemed to echo in the empty park. "You broke the rules." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I took another step back, my heart pounding. The clown's gaze held mine, unblinking, its finger still pointing, accusing. The carousel spun faster, the music building to a feverish pitch, filling the air with a maddening, endless tune. The horses' eyes seemed to gleam, their mouths twisted into snarls, their glassy gazes fixed on me. I turned and ran, the sound of the music chasing me, echoing through the empty park. My footsteps pounded against the ground, the cold night air stinging my lungs as I raced toward the entrance. But no matter how fast I ran, the music followed, a relentless tune that filled my ears, drowning out everything else. I glanced back, just for a moment, and saw the clown standing at the edge of the carousel, watching me with that same mocking smile. Its hand was still raised, waving slowly, its painted eyes glinting in the dark. I tore my gaze away, focusing on the path ahead, desperate to escape the park's grip. Just as I reached the gates, a hand clamped down on my shoulder, its grip cold and unyielding, pulling me back with a force that sent a jolt of terror down my spine. I turned, gasping, and found myself face to face with the clown. Its painted smile stretched wider, too wide, distorting the painted features into something monstrous. The eyes were pools of darkness, gleaming with a hunger that froze me in place. "You're not going anywhere," it hissed, each word slipping through its teeth like a promise, cold and final. Before I could pull away, the clown lunged forward, its mouth open impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth behind the smudged lipstick. I didn't even have time to scream before it sank its teeth into my forearm, tearing through flesh with a ferocity that shattered any remaining illusions of escape. A sickening pain shot up my arm as it bit down, its teeth tearing into my skin, ripping a chunk of flesh free. Blood spilled over my hand, warm and slick, the pain so intense that my vision blurred. I cried out, struggling to pull my arm free, my blood slipping through its fingers. But the clown's grip was iron strong, its mouth pulling back in a smile as it chewed, savoring the taste. I twisted, adrenaline and terror taking over, my heart racing in a frenzy as I used my free hand to punch, claw, anything to force it to release me. The clown's cold eyes met mine, and in them I saw something that nearly stopped my heart. It wasn't satisfaction, nor anger. It was an unyielding, patient calm, as if it knew I had nowhere to go, that it could take its time. Blood dripped from its mouth as it whispered, "You broke the rules." With a surge of desperation, I wrenched myself free, the clown's fingers leaving bruises where they'd held tight. My arm throbbed, each beat of my heart sending fresh pain through the torn flesh. Blood poured down my hand, slicking my fingers as I stumbled backward, clutching my wounded arm. I didn't dare to look at the torn skin, the mangled edges of flesh. I was too focused on escape. The park gate swung shut behind me with a creak that seemed to echo through the empty streets. I kept running until the lights of the park had faded into the distance, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind reeling with images of the night. But even as I slowed to a walk, the feeling that something was following me, just out of sight, remained. I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see the painted face of the clown in the shadows, but the streets were empty. I didn't stop. I kept running, feeling the sting of the air against my wound, the ache spreading through my arm as I staggered down the road, not daring to look back. Behind me, faintly, I could still hear it. The twisted strains of carnival music and the faint, mocking laughter that carried on the wind. By the time I reached my apartment, the night was beginning to fade, a pale gray light touching the horizon. I stumbled inside, my hands shaking as I locked the door behind me, as if that simple barrier could protect me from whatever had lingered in the park. I wanted to believe it was over, that I'd left the horrors behind, but an uneasy feeling settled in my chest, a heaviness that I couldn't shake. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clown's face, its wide grin and hollow eyes watching me with a gaze that felt disturbingly real. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the night, over and over. The rules, the music, the carousel, each one a reminder that there was something in the park that defied understanding. The park had felt alive, aware, as though it were playing with me, testing the limits of my fear. The next morning, I called the park's main office, hoping to reach Davidson, to tell him I couldn't return, that I was done. But when the receptionist picked up, her voice calm and detached, she told me there was no one named Davidson working there. I insisted, explaining that he was the manager, that he'd hired me just a few days ago. But she only repeated herself, her tone growing colder, more distant. I hung up, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. Davidson, the rules, the entire night. All of it felt like a dream, a memory slipping through my fingers. I searched my pockets for the list, the rules I'd carried with me through the night. But my pockets were empty. The paper was gone, as though it had never existed. The days passed slowly, each one bleeding into the next. I stopped sleeping, the memories of the night filling my thoughts with a persistent, creeping unease. Every sound felt amplified, every shadow held. At night, I would catch faint strains of carnival music drifting through the air, a haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere. I would sit up, listening, my heart racing, waiting for the music to fade, but the tune lingered, filling the silence with a hollow, mocking sound. And then, one night, I heard it, the soft, rhythmic tapping, the same sound that had followed me through the park. I froze, my heart pounding, as the tapping grew louder, closer, until it was just outside my window. I held my breath, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The memories of the clown's painted smile filling my mind. Slowly, I turned, my gaze drifting to the window, where the glass reflected a distorted version of my room. For a moment, I saw nothing, just my own face staring back at me, wide-eyed and pale. But then, in the reflection, a figure appeared, standing just behind me, half hidden in shadow. The face was painted in a wide grin, eyes dark and hollow, one hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave. I turned, my pulse racing, but the room was empty. The image faded, leaving only the faint strains of carnival music, a melody that lingered long after the room had fallen silent.